Everyone treats Rick Sanchez like the smartest guy in any room he walks into. Fans quote him like scripture. The internet turned his worst lines into life advice. His own therapist looked him dead in the eye and said his genius was never the point. In this video, we break down how Rick and Morty spent its whole run writing us a warning label, one drunken joke at a time. Section 1. The catchphrase that was actually a cry for help. A grandfather stumbles through a doorway with a bottle in one hand, shouting 4 nonsense words at the top of his lungs, while his grandson stares at him with a mix of confusion and secondhand embarrassment. The words sound like gibberish, something a drunk man might yell just to hear himself make noise. The room laughs, the moment passes. Nobody in that scene treats the phrase as anything more than a joke. And for a long stretch of the show's first season, neither did anyone watching from home. Rick and Morty premiered on Adult Swim in December 2013, created by Justin Roiland and Dan Harmon. The show follows Rick Sanchez, a genius scientist with a portal gun and no patience for consequences, and his grandson Morty Smith, a nervous teenager who gets dragged along on trips across dimensions, planets, and timelines that would break most people. Rick lives with his daughter Beth, her husband Jerry, and their 2 kids, Morty and Summer, in a fairly normal suburban house that constantly gets pulled into interdimensional chaos because Rick refuses to leave his experiments outside the front door. From the very first episode, Rick is written as brilliant, reckless, and deeply unbothered by things that would terrify anyone else. Rick's personality set the tone for the whole show early on. He drinks constantly, treats danger as background noise, and talks to his family the way a person might talk to an intern who keeps making the same mistake. He is funny because he refuses to take anything seriously, including moments that probably deserve to be taken seriously. That refusal became one of the show's signature jokes, and it is exactly the kind of joke that hides something else once a person looks closer. The specific phrase at the center of this section is "wubba lubba dub dub," and its story starts small. It first showed up in the episode Me Seeks and Destroy, the 5th episode of Season 1, where Rick uses it almost like a throwaway punchline after a joke involving a Me Seeks box, a device that creates helper creatures built to solve one task and then disappear. The phrase landed as a strange, upbeat outburst, the kind of thing an eccentric old man might shout just because he liked the sound of his own voice. According to interviews with the show's creators, the phrase was built as a parody of an old-school talk show catchphrase, similar to something a television host from decades earlier might have used to hype up a studio audience. It was designed to sound goofy on purpose. Once it landed with fans, the show brought it back. In the episode Raising Gazorpazorp, Rick uses the same phrase again, and by that point, it had already started sticking to his character the way a nickname sticks to a person after enough people repeat it. Viewers picked it up as shorthand for Rick's whole energy, that loud, chaotic, don't worry about it attitude that made him instantly recognizable. It became one of the first things casual fans learned about the show, even before they understood who Rick was as a person. Adult Swim leaned into that popularity too, using the phrase in promotional material and letting it spread across shirts, mugs, and posters as one of the show's early calling cards. For most of Season 1, the phrase meant exactly what it looked like it meant. Nothing, on purpose, and that was the joke. Underneath that surface joke, the show had already planted something else without drawing attention to it. Rick's oldest friend, a winged humanoid character known simply as Bird Person, had been introduced earlier that same season. Bird Person carried himself with a calm, almost solemn presence that stood out against Rick's chaos, the kind of quiet weight a person gives off when they have known someone through hard years and difficult history. His friendship with Rick went back long before the events of the show, and the two of them clearly understood each other on a level that Rick rarely showed with anyone else, including his own family. That friendship becomes important the moment the phrase gets explained, because the explanation does not come from a stranger or a random alien encountered once and forgotten. It comes from someone who has known Rick for decades. That explanation happens in the Season 1 finale, an episode called Rixie Business. The plot puts Beth and Jerry out of town for the weekend, leaving Morty and Summer in charge of the house with strict instructions to keep things calm and quiet. Rick, predictably, does not respect that plan. He throws a party, inviting an assortment of strange and dangerous friends from across the galaxy, and the house quickly turns into a disaster zone filled with alien guests, chaos, and property damage that Morty and Summer have almost no ability to control. Bird Person attends that party too, standing in the middle of the noise with his usual calm expression, watching the event unfold the way someone watches a familiar storm roll through. At some point during that party, Morty ends up talking with Bird Person, and the conversation turns to Rick's favorite phrase. Morty brings it up the way a person might bring up an inside joke, expecting Bird Person to laugh along with him. Instead, Bird Person tells him the truth. In his native language, the one spoken among his own people, the words wubba lubba dub dub do not mean anything close to a joke. They translate to a plain, direct sentence. I am in great pain. Please help me. Bird Person delivers that translation without any dramatic buildup, the same calm tone he uses for everything else, which makes the moment land even harder. Morty's response is to laugh it off, telling Bird Person that Rick says it ironically, brushing past the idea that his grandfather might mean it. The scene moves on from there almost immediately, folded back into the noise of the party like nothing happened. Nothing about the delivery of that scene asks the audience to stop and reflect. There is no music swell, no lingering camera shot, no moment where the show pauses to make sure everyone caught what just happened. It plays out fast, buried inside a loud, messy party episode, surrounded by jokes and background chaos, which is exactly why so many viewers only noticed it on a second watch. The show handed over one of its most emotionally loaded reveals about its lead character in the middle of a scene built to look like filler. Once that translation became public knowledge among fans, everything from earlier in the season changed shape. Rewatching Me Seeks and Destroy, the scene where Rick first shouts the phrase, reads differently once a person knows what the words actually mean. What looked like a throwaway joke about a Me-Seeks box turns into a moment where Rick is yelling for help in the middle of casual conversation, and nobody around him, including the audience, has any reason to catch it the first time through. The same goes for Raising Gazorpazorp, where the phrase shows up again in a completely unrelated context, carrying the same hidden message every single time Rick says it, whether he means it consciously or not. Recap writers and critics who covered the show after these episodes aired picked up on this pattern fairly quickly, often pointing to the Bird Person scene as one of the quieter, more devastating character moments buried inside an otherwise chaotic season finale. Several pieces written about the show's best or most important scenes single out that exact conversation, framing it as an early example of how much emotional information the show was willing to hide inside comedy before most viewers were paying close enough attention to catch it. That reputation followed the scene for years afterward, and it still gets brought up whenever people discuss which Rick and Morty moment hits the hardest without seeming to try. The phrase also took on a strange second life outside the show itself. For a period of time, typing the exact words into a well-known search engine triggered an Easter egg, returning a suggested correction that read, "Did you mean, 'I am in great pain, please help me'?" Voice assistants built into some phones responded to the phrase with similar lines, sometimes asking if the person speaking needed help, sometimes admitting they did not understand Bird Person language at all. None of that was accidental. It reflected how far the joke had traveled and how widely the hidden meaning had spread beyond people who watched the show closely enough to catch the original scene. At the same time, merchandise built around the phrase kept selling with none of that context attached. Shirts, mugs, and posters printed the words as a fun, high-energy exclamation, something a fan could wear without ever needing to know what it meant in Bird Person's language. That contrast says something on its own. A phrase built entirely around someone quietly asking for help turned into one of the most recognizable pieces of merchandise tied to the show, worn by people who mostly just liked the sound of it and the character behind it. The joke and the meaning kept existing side by side, doing two completely different jobs depending on who was looking at them. What makes this moment worth returning to is not just the reveal itself, but what it set up for the rest of the show going forward. Season 1 spent its runtime establishing Rick as a lovable disaster, a reckless genius who drinks too much and cares too little. And audiences were encouraged to laugh along with that portrayal without much reason to dig deeper. The bird person scene planted a seed that the show would return to again and again in different forms. Jokes that carried real weight underneath them, delivered so quickly and so casually that a person had to already suspect something was wrong to catch it. That approach became one of the clearest fingerprints of the entire series, and it started here, buried in a season finale episode about a house party gone wrong. Rick himself never engages with the translation directly on screen. He does not confirm it, deny it, or acknowledge that Morty and Bird Person have that conversation at all. He keeps using the phrase in later episodes the same way he always had, loud and offhand, treating it like nothing more than a habit. That refusal to address it fits the same pattern that defines nearly everything else about his character. Rick does not explain himself. He does not sit still long enough for anyone to ask him directly whether he is doing okay. And the one time the show lets someone put language to what might actually be going on underneath his behavior, it comes from a translation joke buried in someone else's dialogue, rather than anything Rick says about himself. Bird Person's own story adds another layer to why this scene carries the weight it does. He is established early on as Rick's oldest and closest friend, someone who has been through enough with Rick to understand him in ways nobody else in the show does, including Rick's own family. Later seasons would go on to show just how far that loyalty extended, including events tied to his apparent death and eventual return in an altered form. None of that had happened yet during the events of Rick's business, but the foundation for it was already visible in that one quiet exchange with Morty, a friend who knew Rick well enough to translate his pain without needing Rick to say a single honest word about it himself. None of this required the show to slow down or explain itself. That is part of what makes the moment work as well as it does. The scene trusted its audience to either catch the meaning immediately or stumble onto it later during a rewatch, and either way, the information stayed exactly the same. Rick's favorite phrase, the one that sounded like nonsense from the very first time he shouted it, had a real sentence hiding inside it the entire time, one that nobody in the room chose to take seriously, including the audience watching from home. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That pattern of hiding something real behind something loud did not stay limited to a single catchphrase. It shows up again almost immediately once the flask in Rick's hand gets a closer look. Because a grandfather who drinks constantly through nearly every scene of his own show is doing something that goes far beyond comic timing. And the show never quite lets that detail disappear into the background the way Rick clearly wants it to. Section 2. The Flask Nobody Questions. A man wakes up on a couch with his hair a mess and his shirt half tucked in, blinking against the light like the room itself offended him. He grabs a small metal flask sitting within arm's reach, takes a long drink straight out of it before saying a single word, and stumbles toward his grandson's room to drag him out of bed for a trip across the universe. That is the opening scene of the very first episode, and it sets the tone for a character who would go on to drink his way through every season that followed. That opening scene shows Rick clearly, drunk to the point of losing time, waking Morty in the middle of the night to bring him along on a dangerous ride through another dimension in a homemade flying vehicle. During that same scene, Rick tells Morty he has built a bomb capable of wiping out humanity and offers to let Morty and his crush from school become a kind of new starting point for the human race. Morty forces the vehicle to land, and Rick eventually claims the whole thing was some kind of test meant to push Morty toward being more assertive, right before passing out completely. From the very first minutes of the show, drinking is never just a background detail sitting quietly in the corner of a scene. It drives the plot. That pattern never really goes away. Plain descriptions of the series, the kind used by outlets that track basic show information, describe Rick directly as an alcoholic mad scientist, not as a quirky drinker who enjoys a cocktail now and then. That word gets used without softening, because the show itself never tries very hard to hide what Rick's relationship with alcohol actually looks like. He is shown drinking in nearly every episode across every season, often from the same small metal flask he carries wherever he goes, whether he is standing in his garage, sitting at the dinner table, or floating through open space in a homemade ship. For years, one of the most common questions fans ask about the show had nothing to do with plot, aliens, or parallel universes. It had to do with that flask. What exactly was Rick drinking out of it, constantly, in nearly every scene where he appeared? The question came up so often that the show's own creators ended up answering it directly. During an online question-and-answer session, Dan Harmon confirmed the flask held nothing more exotic than plain vodka, the same drink a person could pick up at any liquor store on Earth. Harmon went further, explaining that Rick could easily use his scientific knowledge to build something stronger, something engineered specifically to keep a steady buzz running through his body at all times without needing to drink anything at all. According to Harmon, Rick chooses not to do that, and the reason ties back to identity rather than convenience. Ordinary vodka picked up from Earth keeps Rick tied to something recognizably human, something normal, even while he spends his life doing things that are anything but normal. That detail matters more than it seems at first. A person capable of building interdimensional travel devices out of spare parts in a garage could, in theory, solve almost any physical problem he wanted to solve, including whatever chemical process leads to intoxication in the first place. Rick does not use his abilities that way. He does not build a better version of drunk. He reaches for the same bottle a regular person might reach for after a hard day. And he does that constantly, across the entire run of the show, without ever treating it as something he has fixed, cured, or moved past. Season 2 adds another layer to that same pattern, showing Rick drinking something described as genetic monstrosity antifreeze straight out of a beaker in a lab setting, treating it the same casual way he treats his usual flask. That scene reinforces something the show repeats without needing to explain it directly. Rick is not particular about what he drinks. He does not care about flavor, presentation, or where the alcohol came from. What matters to him is the effect, the numbing, steady presence of something in his system that keeps him functioning the way he wants to function. Whether it comes from a liquor store on Earth or a laboratory shelf on some alien planet barely changes his behavior at all. Writers who have covered the show's history with drinking often point to Rick's specific choice of vodka as a telling detail on its own. Vodka carries very little flavor compared to other spirits, which means people who drink it heavily are usually drinking for the physical effect rather than for any kind of taste experience. That detail lines up with everything else the show quietly builds around Rick's character. He is not a man enjoying a drink. He is a man maintaining a certain chemical state in his body almost constantly, treating alcohol less like a pleasure and more like something closer to a requirement. None of the other characters in the show treat this as a crisis in any loud or obvious way. Beth rarely comments on her father's drinking directly, despite living under the same roof as him for most of the series, and despite having grown up with him absent for large stretches of her own childhood. Jerry occasionally makes passing remarks about Rick's behavior, usually played for comic effect rather than genuine concern. Summer and Morty mostly treat Rick's drinking as background noise, something so constant and expected that commenting on it barely crosses their minds. The show surrounds Rick with people who either cannot see the drinking clearly or have simply stopped registering it as something worth mentioning, which lets it continue for years without ever becoming the center of a single conversation inside the Smith household. A closer look at how Rick's burping connects to this same pattern adds another piece worth knowing. For the first several seasons, Rick burps constantly through nearly every line of dialogue, slurring words and losing his train of thought mid-sentence in a way that mirrors actual drunk speech almost exactly. That performance choice was not an accident of animation or a random quirk assigned to the character for comic effect. Justin Roiland, who voiced Rick for most of the show's run, physically performed every one of those burps himself while recording dialogue, which meant drinking carbonated soda during recording sessions specifically to produce that sound on command. Over the later seasons, the burping noticeably decreases, and fans picked up on that shift fairly quickly, wondering out loud whether it meant Rick had somehow gotten his drinking under better control. The show never confirms that directly one way or another. Rick still drinks in every season that follows, still carries his flask, still reaches for a drink in moments of stress the same way he always has. What changed was mostly a production decision rather than a stated character arc, since asking a voice actor to burp on command through hundreds of lines of dialogue across years of recording sessions eventually became difficult to sustain. Whatever the reason behind the change, the drinking itself never disappeared from the character. Only the sound effect faded into the background. Later seasons gave the drinking a reason that goes beyond personality or preference, tying it to one of the most serious pieces of backstory the show has ever revealed about Rick. Across Season 6, the show built toward a reveal involving a version of Rick from another dimension, a figure known as Rick Prime, who is eventually confirmed as the person responsible for killing Rick's original wife and daughter years before the events of the series. That loss sits underneath nearly everything Rick does across the whole show, explaining both his refusal to get emotionally close to people and his constant search for ways to numb himself against feeling much of anything at all. The show does not reveal this history early, and it does not use it as an excuse for Rick's worse behavior. It simply exists as part of his history, confirmed directly within the story rather than left to fan speculation. And it reframes every flask, every beaker, and every drink Rick has taken across the entire series as something closer to ongoing self-treatment for a wound that never properly closed. That context changes how earlier seasons read once a person knows about it. Moments that looked like simple comic relief, Rick taking a swig before doing something reckless, Rick slurring through an explanation nobody else in the room could follow, carry a different weight once it becomes clear that his drinking was never separate from his history. He is not simply a scientist who happens to enjoy alcohol. He is a man carrying an old, specific grief that the show waited years to name directly, using alcohol the entire time as one of his only visible ways of managing it. None of this gets treated as an emergency inside the show itself. Nobody stages an intervention. Nobody sits Rick down and asks him to stop. The drinking simply continues, season after season, treated as normal enough that most of the people around him have stopped reacting to it at all. That normalization says almost as much as the drinking itself. A person can spend years surrounded by family, seen constantly reaching for a drink in nearly every waking moment, and still never once hear someone in that same household ask him directly whether he is doing okay. The flask itself never gets treated as a mystery worth solving within the show's own story. Rick never explains why he carries it, never acknowledges it directly to another character, never treats it as anything other than an object that happens to always be within reach. It became a mystery only because audiences outside the show kept asking about it, curious enough to want a straight answer from the people who created him. That gap between what the show treats as unremarkable and what audiences found worth investigating on their own says something about how easily constant, visible drinking can blend into the background of a story once everyone around it has simply gotten used to seeing it there. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same blending into the background becomes even more obvious once the show's central philosophy gets a closer look, because Rick's drinking and his worldview were never separate from each other. They were always working together, one covering for the other, and pulling that thread leads straight into the belief system Rick built to explain why none of it should matter at all. Section 3. The line that explains everything. Morty stands outside his sister's bedroom door while she throws clothes into a bag, getting ready to run away from home. She has just found out something painful about herself, something no 14-year-old should have to sit with. And Morty does not try to fix it with a hug or a soft word. Instead, he tells her the truth as plainly as he can. Existence does not come with a reason attached. Nobody is born somewhere because they were supposed to be. Everyone dies eventually, no matter what they do between now and then. Then, he asks her to come watch television with him, like the sentence he just delivered was nothing heavier than small talk. Summer stops packing. She goes downstairs with him instead. That scene comes from the episode Rixty Minutes, the 8th episode of the first season, which aired in March of 2014. The setup leads there through a family argument. Rick has upgraded the television at home so it can pull in channels from countless other realities, and the family spends the episode flipping through strange, alternate versions of familiar shows just to kill time. Somewhere in the middle of that, Jerry and Beth end up revealing to Summer that her birth was not planned, that they had considered ending the pregnancy before deciding not to, and that raising her changed the direction both their lives were supposed to take. Summer takes that revelation about as hard as anyone would expect. She decides she is done with all of it and starts packing to leave. Morty follows her upstairs, and what he tells her next carries more weight than it should for a scene this short. He admits something that has nothing to do with Summer's situation directly. He tells her that the version of himself standing in front of her is not, technically, her original brother. Earlier events in the season had already established that Rick and Morty had accidentally destroyed their home reality and quietly moved into a new one where alternate versions of themselves had already died, taking their places without ever telling the rest of the family the truth. Morty finally admits that secret to Summer in this exact moment, right before delivering the line about nobody existing on purpose. He is not simply offering comfort. He is telling his sister that neither of them was ever guaranteed to exist in the first place, in more ways than one, and somehow using that fact to talk her out of running away rather than to justify her leaving. The line lands the way it does because of who says it and when. A 14-year-old is not supposed to sound like this. He is not supposed to have an answer this calm and this final for a question this heavy. But Morty has spent an entire season getting dragged through disasters most adults would never recover from, and by episode 8, something in him has clearly shifted. He delivers the idea that life has no built-in purpose the same way a person might mention the weather, without hesitation, without dressing it up. And Summer's reaction says everything about how effective it actually is. She stops crying. She stops packing. She goes downstairs and watches television with her brother like nothing happened. Because in a strange way, something did get resolved, just not through comfort in the way people usually expect comfort to work. Writers who cover the show have pointed to this exact scene as one of the clearest statements the series ever makes about its own worldview. The moment gets treated less like a passing joke and more like something close to a thesis statement. A short piece of dialogue that sums up what the whole show seems to believe about existence. Life is random. Nobody chose to be here in any deep sense. Everybody's story ends the same way, no matter how it starts. And somehow, according to the logic of that scene, none of that has to be crushing. It can even be the thing that lets a person breathe a little easier once they stop fighting it. That idea did not start with Summer's bedroom door. It runs straight through the character standing at the center of the whole show. Rick Sanchez treats meaning the way he treats almost everything else. as something to be dismissed quickly so he can move on to whatever problem is actually in front of him. He rarely stops to reflect on anything. He does not appear to believe that any single choice matters more than any other choice. And that attitude gets repeated across nearly every season in one form or another, whether he is abandoning an entire timeline because it stopped being convenient, or shrugging off a disaster that would leave most people shaking for years. The show never asks its audience to agree with him. It simply keeps putting him in front of them, letting his worldview play out again and again until it becomes one of the most familiar things about the entire series. Dan Harmon, who created the show alongside Justin Roiland, has talked about this part of Rick's character directly in interviews given over the years. Asked in one conversation what he thought the actual point of life was, Harmon gave an answer that leaned into the same territory the show keeps returning to, describing people as something closer to a small, curious piece of a much larger, uncaring system, tasting existence briefly before it moves on without them. He has also said plainly that Rick is not always right, estimating that Rick's read on the universe holds up about half the time and falls apart the other half, despite how confidently Rick delivers every single opinion he has. That detail matters because it means the show was never quietly endorsing everything Rick believes just because he says it the loudest. Harmon built Rick to sound certain, while being wrong just as often as he is right, which changes how his nihilism should be read from the outside looking in. Harmon went further in a separate interview, addressing the question directly instead of dancing around it. Asked whether he personally agreed with Rick that nothing means anything, Harmon said no, explaining that knowing nothing ultimately matters does not actually help a person get through their day. He pointed out that the planet will eventually die, the sun will eventually burn out, and the universe itself is cooling down toward an ending nobody alive will ever see. And none of that changes what a person feels while sitting next to someone they love or spending time with a pet they care about. According to Harmon, once someone actually accepts that nothing carries permanent cosmic weight, something strange happens instead of collapse. Every small moment starts to feel like it counts just as much as any big one, because there is no longer a scale demanding that some moments matter more than others. Nothing mattering, in Harmon's framing, does not lead to despair. It removes the pressure that was making everything feel smaller than it deserved to feel in the first place. That distinction rarely survives contact with how audiences actually talk about the show. Rick's flattest, most dismissive lines get repeated constantly online, turned into profile pictures, tattoos, and captions, almost always stripped of any of the context Harmon spent these interviews trying to explain. The character built specifically to be wrong half the time somehow became a symbol of being right about everything, quoted by people using his worldview to sound clever rather than to actually sit with what Harmon says the show was trying to do with it. That gap between what Harmon has said the character means and how casually his most nihilistic lines get repeated says something on its own about how easily a warning can turn into a slogan once it gets separated from the story surrounding it. Morty's version of the same idea works differently, and that difference is worth paying attention to. He does not deliver his line with any of Rick's detachment. There is a flicker of something almost gentle underneath the bluntness of what he tells Summer, like he has already worked through the worst part of accepting it himself and wants to hand her a shortcut so she does not have to spend as long getting there. He is not shrugging off his sister's pain the way Rick might. He is trying, in his own limited, exhausted way, to help her carry it. That distinction between Rick's nihilism and Morty's version of the same idea matters more than it might look like on the surface, because it shows two different ways the exact same belief can be used. One version treats meaninglessness as an excuse to stop caring about consequences. The other treats it as a reason to stop punishing yourself over things you never had control over to begin with. The show rarely explains which version it wants the audience to walk away with. It simply lays both side by side and lets them sit there. Rick's detachment causes real damage across the series, distancing him from people who love him and leaving a trail of consequences he almost never circles back to clean up. Morty's smaller, quieter version of the same idea, delivered once in a bedroom doorway, manages to talk his sister down from running away from home entirely. Both characters are drawing from the same well. What they build out of it looks nothing alike. Fans who have picked apart this specific scene over the years tend to frame it as one of the moments where the show stops hiding behind jokes and says something close to plainly what it actually thinks about life. One piece written shortly after the episode aired described the moment as functioning almost like a thesis statement for the entire series, boiling everything the show seems to believe about randomness and chaos down into a single short exchange between two kids sitting on a staircase. That kind of reading treats the scene as more than just a clever piece of writing. It treats it as the closest thing the show has to stating its own argument out loud, buried in the middle of an episode that spends most of its runtime on jokes about bad alternate reality television shows. None of this gets delivered with any weight in the moment it actually happens. There is no swelling music behind Morty's line, no long pause afterward, no lingering shot meant to let the audience absorb what just got said. The show moves on almost as quickly as Morty and Summer do, heading back downstairs to keep watching strange channels from other dimensions, like the conversation upstairs barely happened at all. That refusal to slow down and treat the moment as important is, in its own way, exactly the point the whole scene seems to be making. Nothing about life gets a dramatic spotlight just because it deserves one. Big, painful truths get delivered in hallways and bedrooms, in between everything else going on. And then, everyone involved simply keeps living regardless. Later seasons keep circling back to this same territory without ever repeating it in exactly the same way twice. Rick's own history, revealed gradually across the show's run, gives his particular brand of detachment a reason that goes beyond simple philosophy. A person who has lost people he loved in ways he never recovered from has a different relationship with the idea that nothing matters than a person saying it just to sound clever. For Rick, the belief functions less like a worldview he arrived at through careful thought, and more like a wall he built to keep from feeling the full weight of what actually happened to him. Morty, on the other hand, arrived at his own smaller version of the same idea honestly, forced there by a season full of experiences that would break most kids his age, and somehow came out the other side, using it to hold his sister steady instead of pushing everyone else away. That gap between the two of them is where the real warning sits. A worldview built to protect someone from feeling pain can just as easily turn into a worldview that keeps them from feeling anything at all, including the good parts. Rick demonstrates one end of that spectrum across the entire series, distant, guarded, and quick to abandon anything the moment it becomes inconvenient. Morty, at least in this one scene, demonstrates the other end, using the exact same idea to stay present with someone he cares about instead of walking away from her. The show never says out loud which version its audience should walk away believing in. It just keeps setting both of them next to each other, episode after episode, and letting the difference speak for itself. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What makes this section worth sitting inside for a while longer is how directly it connects to everything covered before it. A grandfather shouting a phrase that secretly means he is in pain, a flask he never puts down, and now a belief system built specifically to make sure none of that ever has to be addressed out loud. Nihilism gives Rick permission to treat his own suffering as unimportant, since nothing is supposed to matter anyway. Which means there is never a good enough reason to stop and deal with any of it directly. That protection only holds up as long as nobody ever asks him to sit still long enough to test it. And the show eventually forces exactly that kind of moment on him, dragging his entire philosophy into a therapist's office where none of his usual tricks are going to work. Section 4. Pickle Rick and the Cost of Avoiding Help. A grown man crawls through an air duct system covered in rat blood, wearing a mechanical suit built out of a dead rodent's body, moving through a building filled with armed guards who have no idea what they are actually dealing with. That man used to be a human being named Rick Sanchez. Before any of this happened, before the rat suit, before the fights, before the escape through a Russian crime syndicate's compound, Rick made one very specific choice. He turned himself into a pickle so he would not have to sit in a room and talk about his feelings. That is the actual plot of the episode Pickle Rick, the third episode of Season 3, which aired in August of 2017 and was written by Ryan Ridley. The setup is almost embarrassingly simple compared to everything that follows it. Beth and Jerry have gone through a divorce, and as part of dealing with the fallout, the family starts attending group therapy sessions with a therapist named Dr. Wong. Rick has avoided this kind of thing for years, and when the day finally comes for him to join the rest of the family in her office, he decides the better plan is to build a device that turns him into a pickle instead of showing up. He does this simply to prove that he is capable of doing it, treating the entire idea of talking to a therapist as something beneath him, something he would rather solve with a science experiment than face directly. The problem is that pickles do not have arms, legs, or any way to move around on their own once something goes wrong. And something does go wrong, almost immediately. A stray cat drags Pickle Rick out through a drain and into the sewer system, where he ends up stuck, unable to change back, forced to build tools out of whatever he can find just to survive long enough to get home. What follows takes up most of the episode, an increasingly wild sequence of Rick fighting off rats, killing one and hollowing it out to use its body as a kind of walking suit, getting swept into a Russian criminal operation, and eventually working his way through armed guards, a prisoner named Jaguar he convinces to help him, and an administrator running the whole operation. All so he can rig the building to explode and escape by helicopter. None of this happens because Rick needed to save the world or protect his family from some outside threat. All of it happens because Rick built a machine specifically designed to get him out of 1 hour of therapy. And that decision spiraled into one of the most violent, chaotic sequences in the entire show. Meanwhile, back in Dr. Wong's office, something much quieter is happening. Beth, Summer, and Jerry sit through the session without Rick, and Dr. Wong starts asking questions that circle around exactly the kind of thing Rick built an entire pickle body to avoid. She notices Beth's discomfort with emotional vulnerability, drawing a line between that discomfort and the same pattern showing up in Rick. At one point, the family tries an exercise where each person is supposed to speak honestly about their own feelings, using simple, direct language instead of blaming each other. And the discomfort in the room during that exercise says almost as much as anything spoken out loud. This is the actual center of the episode, quiet and slow, sitting directly across from the loud, bloody action happening to Rick at the exact same time. The show cuts back and forth between the two halves on purpose, letting the audience watch a grown man tear through a criminal organization while his own family sits in a room, finally starting to say the things nobody in that household usually says out loud. Rick eventually does make it back, still wearing pieces of the rat suit, covered in blood, arriving at Dr. Wong's office because there is nowhere else left to go. What happens next in that office is the part of the episode people keep coming back to years after it aired. Rick sits down and admits, in his own way, that he lied to get out of the session. He explains himself using the same logic he uses for almost everything else in his life. He tells Dr. Wong that he does not respect what she does for a living, that he is a scientist who builds and destroys and changes things directly, instead of sitting in an office listening to someone explain which words match which feelings. He tells her that kind of talking might help some people feel comfortable enough to stop panicking, but that comfort is not something he wants for himself, comparing it to the kind of calm state people value in animals raised for food, rather than something worth wanting as a person. Dr. Wong does not raise her voice or push back with anger. She responds calmly, and what she says next is one of the most direct pieces of analysis the show has ever aimed at its own main character. She tells Rick that the only real connection between his intelligence and the sickness spreading through his family is that everyone in that family, himself included, uses intelligence as a way to justify sickness rather than deal with it. She points out that Rick swings back and forth between treating his own mind as an unstoppable weapon and treating it as something closer to a curse he cannot escape. And she suggests that the one idea Rick genuinely cannot stand thinking about is that his mind, and everything he does with it, has always been fully within his own control. She reminds him that he chose to come to her office that day, chose to sit down, chose to spend his time belittling her job, the same way he chose, earlier that same day, to turn himself into a pickle rather than show up as a person. She tells him plainly that he is, by his own admission, the one steering his entire life, and yet here he sits anyway, covered in blood and rat remains, having spent an enormous mind on nothing more than proving a point to himself. She goes further, telling him she has no doubt that regular therapy would bore him completely, comparing it to how bored she gets brushing her own teeth or cleaning herself up. Because repairing and maintaining something is not the same as going on an adventure. That comparison lands with more weight than it might seem to carry at first. Rick spent an entire episode turning a boring hour of talking into an action movie because sitting still with his own feelings felt unbearable to him in a way that fighting through armed guards apparently did not. Dr. Wong names that pattern out loud, directly to his face, without flinching and without softening it for his benefit. Rick does not have much of a response to any of this. He sits there quietly, staring at her, clearly turning her words over in his head without offering anything back. On the way home, he apologizes to Beth for lying about the whole thing, then finally uses the antidote he built earlier to turn himself back into a human being. That apology is one of the only moments in the episode where Rick shows something close to sincerity without hiding behind a joke first. None of that lasts very long. Almost immediately afterward, Summer and Morty mention wanting to keep going to therapy, interested in what Dr. Wong had to say, and Rick and Beth respond by making fun of the whole idea, brushing off the therapist's insight and turning their attention toward going out drinking instead. The episode does not pretend that one difficult conversation fixed anything. Rick heard exactly what he needed to hear, sat with it just long enough to feel the weight of it, and then walked straight back into the same behavior that got him there in the first place. This time, bringing his daughter along with him instead of dealing with any of it further. The final scene of the episode drives that point home without needing to explain itself. In a moment shown after the credits, the villain from the main action plot, a piano-obsessed enemy named Concerto, is preparing to kill Rick and Morty strapped down inside a giant piano. Jaguar, the prisoner Rick had helped escape earlier, shows up and saves them both at the last second. Rick turns to Morty right afterward and tells him this exact situation is the reason people should avoid therapy, treating a near-death experience inside a piano as somehow proof that talking about his feelings would have been the worst choice. That line works as a joke, but it also captures exactly the pattern Dr. Wong spent the whole episode describing. Rick will always find a way to reframe chaos, danger, and violence as a more reasonable choice than sitting still and being honest about what is actually going on inside him. Writers who cover this episode tend to agree that its most important material has almost nothing to do with the action plot people usually remember it for first. Several pieces written about the episode point directly to Dr. Wong's monologue as one of the sharpest, most clear-eyed pieces of writing the show has ever produced, treating it as close to the emotional center of the entire season rather than a side plot squeezed in around a violent adventure story. One piece described the scene as functioning almost like a direct answer to everything Rick's nihilism tries to excuse. A moment where someone finally sits across from him and names exactly what his intelligence has been doing this whole time, instead of letting the joke stand on its own without comment. That reading treats Dr. Wong's office as the actual heart of the episode, with the rat suit and the exploding compound working as a loud, elaborate distraction built specifically to delay a conversation Rick had been avoiding for years. The details behind how this episode came together add another layer worth knowing. Ryan Ridley, the writer credited with the episode, has said in interviews that it was never meant to be a direct parody of any one specific action movie, though it does draw on ideas from films involving extreme survival situations. Dan Harmon has also spoken about the personal timing behind the episode, mentioning that he was going through his own divorce and had started therapy himself around the period this episode was being written. And that experience shaped how directly and how seriously the show ended up treating therapy within the story. That context matters because it means the writing behind Dr. Wong's monologue was not built from a distance. It came out of someone actually sitting in that kind of room himself, around the same time the episode was being put together, which helps explain why her lines land with as much precision as they do. Susan Sarandon voiced Dr. Wong in this episode, giving the character a calm, steady presence that never once matches Rick's chaos, no matter how loud or violent his half of the episode gets. That contrast in tone between the two halves of the story is not an accident. The show wanted the quiet office scenes to feel completely unaffected by the noise happening elsewhere, because that stillness is exactly what Rick cannot stand being around. Dr. Wong never raises her voice, never gets pulled into Rick's chaos, never lets him turn their conversation into another adventure the way he turns everything else in his life. She simply sits there, asks questions, and waits. And that patience is precisely what makes Rick so uncomfortable that turning himself into a vegetable seemed like the more reasonable plan. This episode connects directly back to everything already covered. Rick's drinking works as one way of keeping real feelings at arm's length. His belief that nothing truly matters works as another. Turning himself into a pickle to dodge 1 hour of talking is simply a third version of the exact same pattern, dressed up as an action movie instead of a quiet, private habit. Each one gives Rick a reason to avoid sitting still with anything uncomfortable, and each one gets treated by the people around him as something closer to a personality trait than a problem worth addressing directly. Dr. Wong is the only person in the entire series who manages to say all of this to Rick's face in plain, direct language. And even then, the moment passes without changing much of anything about how he continues to live. That failure to change matters just as much as the diagnosis itself. A single conversation, no matter how accurate or well delivered, does not undo years of using intelligence, chaos, and constant motion as a way of staying one step ahead of anything that might require him to slow down. Rick heard exactly what was wrong, understood it clearly enough to go quiet and simply stare back at Dr. Wong without a comeback ready, and still walked out of that office heading straight back toward the same habits that landed him there in the first place. The show never suggests that one hard conversation is supposed to fix a person. It shows, plainly, what happens when someone hears the truth about themselves clearly and chooses to keep moving anyway. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same refusal to slow down and take responsibility for the damage he causes shows up again almost immediately once an entirely different kind of consequence gets examined. One that stretches far beyond Rick's own family and reaches an entire planet full of people who never got any say in what happened to them. Section 5. What happens when you play God? A boy stands on a rooftop overlooking a city that no longer has any people left inside it. At least, not any that still look human. Down below, twisted, mutated bodies stumble through the streets, the leftover result of something that started as a simple crush on a girl at school. His grandfather stands next to him, completely calm, already working out the fastest way to leave this version of reality behind and step into a different one where none of this ever happened to them personally. That is the ending of Rick Potion number 9, the 6th episode of Season 1, which aired in January of 2014. The episode starts small. Morty wants a girl from school named Jessica to fall in love with him before an upcoming school dance. So he asks Rick to help him make that happen through science, instead of doing anything that resembles actually talking to her. Rick builds a cologne using vole DNA, since voles are known for forming intense, permanent attachments to their first mate, and hands it over to Morty with almost no explanation about how it actually works. What Rick fails to mention is that the effect does not stay contained to one person. If the original target happens to be sick with something else at the time, the attraction spreads to anyone that person comes into contact with afterward, turning it into something closer to a virus than a simple crush. Jessica happens to have the flu that day. The moment Morty uses the cologne near her, she becomes intensely fixated on him, and the effect spreads immediately to the people around her. From there, it moves through the school, then through the rest of the town, then across the entire planet, turning ordinary people into obsessive, mutated versions of themselves as the virus keeps mixing with itself and evolving into something worse the more it spreads. Rick tries to fix his own mistake by adding another piece of science into the mix, using praying mantis DNA in an attempt to counteract the vole effect. And that attempt backfires just as badly. Instead of curing anyone, it finishes turning nearly the entire human population into grotesque, distorted creatures, later nicknamed Cronenbergs by fans as a reference to a filmmaker known for stories about the human body twisting into something unrecognizable. By the time Rick realizes there is no scientific fix left to try, the disaster has already spread past the point of undoing. Nearly everyone on the planet, aside from a handful of members of Morty's own family, has been transformed into something no longer recognizably human. Rick's response to this outcome is where the episode shifts from a wild, silly premise into something considerably darker. Rather than staying in that ruined reality to deal with what happened, or trying to find any lasting way to reverse it, Rick decides the smarter option is simply to leave. He explains to Morty that the number of possible realities is essentially endless, which means there is almost certainly a version of this exact same universe out there where some other Rick and Morty already managed to fix the exact same disaster, only to die shortly afterward in an unrelated accident. All Rick has to do is find that specific reality and slip into it, taking the place of the two people who already died there, leaving the ruined version of their own world behind completely. That is exactly what happens. Rick and Morty locate a matching reality where the alternate versions of themselves had indeed solved the same crisis, only to be killed almost immediately afterward by a small explosion while working on an unrelated invention in their garage. Rick and Morty step through a portal directly into that garage, finding the burnt, lifeless bodies of their alternate selves lying on the floor in front of them. Rather than treating this as horrifying, Rick calmly explains the plan to a visibly shaken Morty, telling him this is simply how it has to work, since somewhere out there in the infinite number of possible universes, a version of the two of them managed to survive this exact mess, and all they had to do was find that one and step into it. Morty, still in shock, goes along with it, and the two of them bury the bodies of their dead counterparts in the backyard before quietly taking over their lives, moving forward as though nothing unusual had happened. Before any of that burial takes place, Rick pauses to say something to Morty that lands with an unexpected edge given everything that just happened. He tells Morty, in blunt terms, that he had essentially built something close to a drug meant to force someone into wanting him without their consent. and that the disaster spreading across the planet was, in a very real sense, a direct consequence of that choice. It is a rare moment where Rick names the actual moral weight of what happened rather than brushing past it entirely, even while he is simultaneously working out how to abandon the consequences instead of facing them directly. The final scene of the episode does not stay with Rick and Morty in their new replacement reality. Instead, it cuts back to the abandoned world they left behind, showing what remains of the original Smith family living out of an armored van, having survived the Cronenberg apocalypse by adapting to it rather than escaping from it. Summer, Beth, and Jerry are shown roasting one of the mutated creatures over a fire, treating their new survival lifestyle with a strange, dark kind of normalcy. Summer even sets up her own version of a talk show using a shattered piece of technology, hosting a segment for whatever audience might be watching in a ruined world that no longer has any television networks left to broadcast anything real. The scene plays for a laugh, layered over the fact that an entire planet's worth of people were left to fend for themselves inside a nightmare that Rick and Morty personally caused and then simply walked away from. The episode does not treat this ending as a cliffhanger to be resolved later, at least not right away. For a long stretch of the show's run, this reality and everyone left inside it simply disappear from the story, treated as a closed door rather than an ongoing thread. That silence is its own kind of statement. An entire version of Earth, home to billions of people who had no say in any of it, gets quietly written off the moment it becomes inconvenient. And the show moves forward as though the replacement family Rick and Morty stepped into is simply the real one now. That silence does eventually get broken, though not for a while. In the Season 3 episode, The Rick Shank Rickdemption, Rick finally admits the truth to the rest of the family, explaining directly that the Beth, Jerry, and Summer they have been living with since that swap are not biologically the same people who raised Morty and Summer from birth. The family's reaction to hearing this, so long after the fact, adds another layer to how the show treats consequences that get delayed rather than avoided completely. Nobody in that room had any idea they were living inside a situation built entirely around a disaster that happened on a completely different version of Earth. One that Rick had simply chosen not to mention for years. The Cronenberg dimension itself does not stay forgotten forever either. Season 6's premiere episode, Solarix, revisits that same ruined world directly, pulling characters back into contact with the fallout from that original disaster during an unrelated crisis involving the portal fluid Rick relies on to travel between dimensions. Surviving family members from that abandoned reality, people who adapted to living inside a world full of Cronenbergs for years, show up again, forcing a version of Rick from the current timeline to confront a mess his past self created and then walked away from without ever looking back. What makes this whole sequence of events land the way it does is how casually Rick treats each step of it. He does not panic when the virus spreads out of control. He does not treat the transformation of an entire planet's population as a crisis worth staying to fix properly. He simply looks for the most efficient exit available to him, treats an alternate version of reality as something disposable the moment it stops being useful, and asks his own grandson to bury a version of himself in the backyard as though it were an ordinary chore rather than something that should leave lasting damage on a 14-year-old's sense of what reality even is. Multiple pieces written about this episode describe that exact moment, the choice to abandon one reality for another rather than deal with the consequences directly, as one of the darkest turns the show made in its entire first season, treating individual universes as something close to replaceable the moment they stop being convenient to live in. Morty's reaction throughout all of this deserves attention on its own. He does not celebrate the plan or treat it as clever the way Rick seems to. He looks shaken, standing over the corpse of his own alternate self, clearly disturbed by what he is being asked to do. And he goes along with it anyway, because Rick has already decided this is how things are going to happen, and there does not appear to be any other option on the table. That moment plants something that follows Morty through the rest of the series. He knows, from this point forward, exactly how easily his grandfather is willing to erase an entire version of reality once it becomes a problem rather than a convenience. And he knows that willingness extends to versions of Morty himself, buried without much ceremony the moment a more convenient option becomes available. That detail connects directly to something referenced earlier in Rick's Minutes, when Morty shows Summer the graves sitting in their own backyard and finally admits the truth about where their family actually came from. The emotional weight of that later scene depends entirely on what happened here first, in Rick Potion number 9, when Morty was forced to bury his own dead double, without much warning or explanation beyond Rick's calm insistence that this was simply the most efficient path forward. Two very different episodes, aired months apart, are built around the exact same event. One showing the disaster as it happens, and the other showing how quietly it kept sitting underneath the family's ordinary life afterward, waiting for someone to finally say it out loud. The choice to abandon an entire reality rather than fix it says something specific about how Rick handles consequences in general. He is capable of enormous feats of science, able to build cures, weapons, and machines that can solve almost any physical problem placed in front of him. Yet when faced with a disaster he personally caused, his first instinct is not repair, it is escape. Given access to infinite versions of reality, Rick treats that abundance less like a responsibility and more like a loophole. A way to walk away from any mistake simply by finding a version of events where the mistake never had to be dealt with directly. That pattern would keep echoing forward, showing up again any time the show needed to demonstrate exactly how far Rick was willing to go to avoid staying somewhere and cleaning up something painful. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There is one version of Morty, though, who eventually stopped accepting that pattern altogether, refusing to keep living inside a story built around a grandfather who treats entire worlds as disposable. That refusal did not happen quietly, and it did not happen without consequences of its own. And tracing exactly how far that rebellion went means looking directly at the one Morty who finally decided he had seen enough. Section 6. The one Morty who got out. A boy sits alone in a chair, one eye covered by a metal patch, staring at a screen showing an infinite wall of identical grandfathers stretching out into the distance. Every single one of them believes he is the smartest version of himself in existence. Every single one of them is wrong about that in exactly the same way. This boy figured that out a long time ago, and unlike almost every other Morty across every other timeline, he decided he was not going to spend his life quietly accepting it. Fans know him as Evil Morty, though the show itself never actually used that name out loud until years after he first appeared on screen. He shows up for the first time in a Season 1 episode from 2014 called Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind. That episode opens with the Smith family eating breakfast, when a portal opens and a different, scarred version of Rick steps through, with a Morty wearing an eye patch standing beside him. That alternate Rick kills the show's main Rick almost immediately and kidnaps Morty, only for the scene to reset the next morning, revealing that the family scene in the opening was actually a different timeline entirely, separate from the one the show usually follows. From there, the real Rick gets taken by armed, uniformed versions of himself to a place called the Citadel of Ricks, a massive interdimensional base built as a kind of shelter for versions of Rick and Morty pulled in from countless different timelines. Morty gets brought along too, and what he finds inside the Citadel unsettles him almost immediately. Mortys living there are not treated as equals to the Ricks around them. They are sorted, assigned, and used almost like interchangeable parts, valued mainly for how useful or replaceable they happen to be, rather than treated as individuals worth any real consideration. A governing group called the Council of Ricks runs the whole operation, and their attitude toward the visiting Rick, the one the show usually follows, comes across as openly dismissive, treating his independent streak as a flaw rather than something worth respecting. Rick eventually gets framed for a string of murders committed against other Ricks across the Citadel, and the actual culprit turns out to be that scarred Rick from the opening scene, working under the direction of someone else entirely. That someone else is the eye patch Morty, who has been quietly controlling his own Rick this entire time using implanted technology, treating his own grandfather less like family and more like a tool built to be pointed in whatever direction served his purposes. The show's main Morty ends up leading a small rebellion of other captured Mortys held inside the Citadel's base. And once Rick's name gets cleared, the visiting family moves on, leaving the eye patch Morty behind as an unresolved mystery rather than a fully explained threat. That mystery stayed mostly untouched for years. The eye patch Morty makes no other confirmed appearance until Season 3's episode The Ricklantis Mix-Up, which aired in 2017 as one of the rare episodes that steps away from the show's main Rick and Morty entirely to spend its runtime inside the Citadel itself. By this point, the Citadel has become something resembling an actual society, complete with its own economy, its own police force made up of Ricks, and its own political system, including an upcoming election for a new leadership position. A Morty going by the name Candidate Morty enters that election, and almost nobody involved takes his campaign seriously at first, including his own campaign manager, who treats the whole run as something closer to a joke than a real political effort. That changes during a debate, when Candidate Morty delivers a speech pointing directly at the divide running through life inside the Citadel, calling out how differently Ricks and Mortys get treated within the very same walls, despite supposedly sharing equal standing in that society. The speech lands with real weight among the crowd watching, shifting the race almost overnight. Shortly afterward, Candidate Morty fires his own campaign manager, a decision that plays as a small, sharp signal about exactly how far he is willing to go once something outlives its usefulness to him. He goes on to win the election, becoming the first Morty ever elected to lead the Citadel of Ricks. And the final moments of the episode reveal him removing a covering from one eye to show the exact same eye patch worn by the mysterious Morty from that earlier Season 1 episode years before. The two characters, kept separate for years in the minds of fans still piecing the connection together, are confirmed as the same person. Between that reveal and the character's next major appearance, very little got explained directly. A short film released later made a brief, non-canon reference to him, but the show itself left the character mostly alone until Season 5's finale, an episode called Rick Mirai Jack, which aired in 2021. That episode finally gives the character a full spotlight again, explaining exactly what he has been working toward this entire time, and exactly how far he is willing to go to get there. The explanation centers on something called the central finite curve, a term first mentioned briefly back in that original Season 1 episode, without much detail attached to it. Rick Mirai Jack finally spells out what it actually means. The central finite curve refers to the specific, limited collection of universes where Rick Sanchez happens to be the smartest version of himself compared to everyone else around him. Every Rick trapped inside that section of the multiverse believes he is uniquely brilliant, uniquely capable, uniquely important, without realizing that his own sense of superiority only exists because he is boxed inside a narrow slice of reality specifically built to keep that illusion intact. Step outside that boundary, and none of that specialness holds up anymore. There are other versions of existence entirely where a completely different kind of intelligence rules everything instead, and Rick's particular brand of genius stops meaning anything at all. This Morty figured that out. Rather than staying trapped inside a life where he was permanently treated as a lesser version of a person, tied to a Rick who saw him as expendable, he built an elaborate, patient plan to escape the entire structure keeping him locked in place. That plan involved seizing control of the Citadel itself, using its population, made up of countless other Ricks and Mortys pulled from countless other timelines, as a resource to power his way out of the central finite curve entirely. Along the way, he had been controlling a version of Rick through implanted technology since childhood, using that connection to access information and memories belonging to the main Rick the show usually follows, all while presenting himself publicly as an ordinary Morty nobody needed to take seriously. Mr. Poopy Butthole, a recurring character connected to the Smith family, is the one who finally puts a name to what this Morty has become, referring to him directly as Evil Morty in the scene that plays after the episode's credits. That is the first time the show itself uses the name fans had already been using for years, treating the label almost like a punchline rather than a dramatic reveal, matching the show's habit of underplaying moments that would get treated as enormous turning points in almost any other series. What makes this character worth returning to after everything covered in earlier sections is what his entire arc represents next to Rick's usual behavior. Rick treats other Mortys, other realities, and even other versions of his own family as replaceable the moment they become inconvenient, something already covered directly through the events of Rick Potion number 9. Evil Morty grew up inside a version of that same system, treated exactly the way the Citadel treats every other Morty, sorted and undervalued simply for being born a Morty instead of a Rick. Rather than accepting that treatment the way most other Mortys across the multiverse apparently do, he spent years building a way out of it entirely, willing to use manipulation, violence, and, eventually, an entire population of other people just like him in order to finally step outside the system that had been keeping him boxed in his whole life. That willingness to use others in order to escape complicates any simple reading of him as purely a victim standing up for himself. He does not free other Mortys from the Citadel's unfair treatment. He uses their existence as fuel for his own personal exit, treating them with almost exactly the same disregard the Council of Ricks showed toward Mortys in general back in his first appearance. In that sense, escaping the system did not necessarily mean escaping the pattern the system had taught him. He simply moved from being someone the pattern was done to, toward being someone willing to do the exact same thing to others once he had enough power to make that choice for himself. Rick's own reaction to him carries weight worth noticing too. Across nearly every other conflict in the show, Rick treats problems as things to be outsmarted, outplanned, or simply avoided through some clever use of science. Evil Morty is different. He represents someone who understands the exact rules Rick relies on well enough to use those same rules against him. Someone who grew up close enough to that world to see through the illusion Rick spends his whole life standing on top of without ever fully examining it himself. That makes him one of the very few figures in the entire show who Rick cannot simply talk circles around or escape through some clever trick. Because Evil Morty was raised inside the same trick and learned exactly how it works from the inside. The show never gives Evil Morty a tidy ending or a clear moral lesson attached to his story. Rick Mirai Jack closes with him finally escaping the central finite curve entirely, stepping outside the narrow slice of reality that once made every Rick around him feel important, choosing to walk away from the entire structure rather than stay and fight for a better version of it. Whether that counts as a victory, a warning, or simply an escape without a clear destination gets left entirely open, matching the way the show tends to handle its heaviest ideas throughout its whole run, delivered plainly, and then left alone without a lecture attached, explaining exactly how the audience is supposed to feel about it. His existence complicates the idea, raised earlier through Rick's own nihilism, that nothing happening across an infinite multiverse is supposed to carry much weight. Evil Morty spent years building an extremely specific, deliberate plan aimed at a very particular outcome, treating his own escape as something worth enormous cost and enormous patience. That kind of determination sits strangely next to a worldview that treats existence as random and interchangeable. He did not act like someone who believed nothing mattered. He acted like someone who believed his own freedom mattered enough to burn down an entire system in order to get it, even if that system had spent his whole life training him to see nobody, including himself, as anything more than replaceable. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same tension between what Rick claims to believe and how differently the people closest to him actually end up living shows up again once attention turns away from Rick's grandson entirely and lands instead on someone who spent years trying to love him the old-fashioned way, only to find out exactly how quickly that kind of closeness gets treated as disposable the moment it stops being convenient. Section 7. The Woman Who Saw What Loving Rick Actually Costs. A giant floating ship drifts through space, distress signal blinking. Rick tells his grandkids that 9 times out of 10, a call like this means a ship full of dead aliens worth looting. He is wrong this time. What waits inside is not treasure. It is an old relationship he never fully got over, wearing the face of an entire planet. That setup opens Autoerotic Assimilation, the 3rd episode of Season 2, which aired in August of 2015. Rick, Morty, and Summer board the ship expecting an easy scavenging trip, and instead find its surviving crew members explaining that their homeworld has been taken over by something that erases individual will and folds every person on the planet into a single, shared consciousness. Before any of them can process what that actually means, the same entity responsible for taking over the ship's crew reaches out and assimilates them too, absorbing their separate minds into itself. Rick reacts to this development in a way nobody expects. He recognizes the voice speaking through all of them at once, and after a beat of visible discomfort, admits that he and this hive mind, who introduces herself as Unity, used to be involved with each other, back before any of this happened. Unity explains her own nature directly once the initial shock wears off. She is not one single person, the way Rick, Morty, or Summer are. She exists as a kind of shared awareness spread across everyone she has assimilated, capable of controlling every person she has folded into herself at once, while still experiencing something like individual thought and feeling underneath all of it. Over the course of the episode, Unity demonstrates this ability across several different worlds, taking over a population of artists, a group of aliens locked in constant war with each other, and a society still living in something resembling an earlier, less advanced age of history. In each case, she describes the same basic trade taking place. The people she absorbs lose their individual will and their personal identity, but in exchange, entire populations stop fighting each other, stop struggling with the kinds of problems that come from disagreement and division, and start functioning instead as a single, unified whole. Rick, reunited with Unity after however long they had been apart, throws himself completely into rekindling the relationship. And the show does not shy away from showing exactly how far that goes. He spends the episode indulging in elaborate personal fantasies made possible only because Unity can reshape entire populations around whatever he wants in the moment, turning assimilated crowds into whatever version of a party or a scene he happens to feel like living inside. Morty and Summer, meanwhile, get looked after by Unity's assimilated population, while Rick disappears into his own version of an extended, unchecked bender, uninterested in checking on his grandkids or paying attention to anything outside the excess he has thrown himself into. Summer's arc within the same episode runs alongside Rick's, giving the story its own separate thread about what it costs to lose individual identity, even when that loss comes wrapped in comfort. At first, she resists the idea of an entire species being folded into a single collective will, uncomfortable with what that erasure actually represents. Her feelings shift over the course of the episode, especially once Unity's assimilated population, still functioning as a coordinated force even while under her control, saves both Morty and Summer from a dangerous situation involving a separate group of hostile aliens. Watching that rescue play out complicates Summer's earlier resistance to what unity represents, leaving her arc less like a simple lesson and more like an open question about whether the kind of unity offers is worth what it costs. None of that complexity changes what eventually happens between Rick and Unity themselves. At some point during the episode, Unity leaves without a dramatic confrontation, choosing instead to disappear while Rick is briefly out of the room, leaving behind a short note rather than staying to argue the point directly. The note explains, in short terms, that despite everything good about their time together, staying with Rick simply is not something she can continue doing. She recognizes what being close to him actually does to her, how his presence pulls her further into the same kind of chaos and self-destruction that already defines so much of who he is, undermining the very stability she is supposed to be providing to the populations she has taken over. Leaving is framed as her own decision, made with clear eyes about exactly what continuing the relationship would cost her. Rick's reaction to that departure is where the episode shifts completely in tone. He returns home changed, visibly withdrawn, and when Beth confronts him about the alien he had been secretly keeping locked in the family's basement without permission, Rick does not fight back or deflect the way he usually would. He simply agrees with her and quietly retreats to the garage instead, offering no resistance at all, which is itself unusual enough for his character to signal that something serious has shifted underneath the surface. Once alone, Rick assembles the pieces of a weapon capable of ending a life instantly. Before turning it on himself, he first uses it on a suffering, deformed creature he had been keeping frozen in storage, holding the creature gently and comforting it in its final moments before ending its suffering. He then turns the same weapon toward himself, clearly intending to use it the same way, and the episode allows that intention to sit on screen without softening it or rushing past it. Rick passes out from exhaustion before the weapon can fully complete its cycle, which is the only reason the attempt does not succeed. The following morning, he is shown passed out at his own workstation, alive only because his body gave out before his plan could finish. The show does not treat that sequence as something to laugh through, the way it treats so much of Rick's other behavior. Critics who wrote about the episode after it aired described that final stretch as some of the most carefully handled, seriously written material the show had produced up to that point, distinguishing it clearly from the chaos and comedy filling most of the runtime leading up to it. One review specifically framed the ending as proof that Rick, for all his bravado and detachment, is ultimately someone who depends on connection with others far more than his usual behavior would suggest. Someone whose confidence collapses the moment the one relationship capable of matching his intensity walks away from him for his own good rather than because she stopped caring. Unity's departure carries a particular weight precisely because of what she represents structurally within the story. She is not simply an ex-girlfriend who got tired of Rick's behavior. She is, by design, someone capable of literally becoming an entire population at once, powerful enough to reshape whole civilizations according to her will. And even she recognizes that staying close to Rick threatens to unravel that stability from the inside. If a being with that much control over reality cannot stay near Rick without being pulled toward the same chaos and self-destruction that defines him, that says something specific about the kind of influence Rick carries into every relationship he enters, regardless of how much power the other person walks in with. The episode also complicates any easy read of Unity as simply a victim of Rick's influence. Her own note, along with her behavior throughout the episode, suggests that the parts of herself she indulges most freely around Rick are not foreign additions he forces onto her from the outside. They are already present in her, waiting for exactly the kind of environment Rick provides in order to surface without restraint. That detail matters because it reframes the relationship as less about one person corrupting another and more about two people who bring out each other's worst tendencies specifically because neither one requires the other to pretend to be anything less destructive than they actually are. Whatever comfort that offered while it lasted clearly was not enough to make staying together sustainable, at least according to Unity's own judgment once she chose to leave. Rick's collapse afterward reveals something about his character that rarely surfaces this directly anywhere else in the show. For a man who spends nearly every other episode treating relationships, families, and entire realities as replaceable the moment they become inconvenient, losing Unity produces a reaction that looks nothing like his usual detachment. He does not shrug this loss off the way he shrugs off destroyed planets or abandoned versions of his own family. He isolates completely, drinks and behaves recklessly to the point of physical exhaustion, and ultimately reaches for a weapon meant to end his own life, stopped only by his body giving out before he could finish. That gap between how Rick treats the loss of an entire civilization elsewhere in the show and how he responds to losing one specific relationship says something worth sitting with about which kinds of loss actually manage to break through his usual defenses. This section connects directly back to patterns already covered. The same man who drinks constantly to keep from feeling anything too sharply, who built an entire worldview around the idea that nothing really matters, who turned himself into a vegetable rather than sit through 1 hour of therapy, is shown here reaching a point where none of those usual defenses hold up anymore. Alcohol does not fix what losing Unity does to him. Nihilism does not make the loss feel smaller. The chaos and excess he throws himself into during their reunion and the deeper collapse that follows once she leaves show exactly what happens once the one relationship capable of matching Rick's intensity disappears, leaving him alone with everything his usual coping methods were built specifically to help him avoid facing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What Unity walked away from was never really about Rick's chaos existing separately from her own. It was about recognizing that being close to that particular kind of chaos threatened to unmake the very stability she was responsible for holding together elsewhere. A conclusion that becomes even clearer once a completely different figure in Rick's life, someone who never had Unity's option to simply leave, ends up building an entire private ritual around trying to hold on to something just as fragile all on his own. Section 8. The man who built an entire planet just to be alone. A single toilet sits on an empty planet, positioned perfectly to look out over rolling alien fields and a soft-colored sky, with absolutely nobody around for miles in any direction. That toilet was not left there by accident. Rick built the whole setup himself, chose the planet specifically because nothing intelligent lived there, and treated the entire arrangement as sacred, right up until the day he found a broken branch nearby and realized somebody else had been using it. That is the plot of The Old Man and the Seat, the second episode of Season 4, which aired in November of 2019 and was written by Michael Waldron. The episode opens with Rick heading to his private bathroom, described by other characters as something he is unusually shy about, and discovering signs that someone has trespassed on land he considers entirely his own. Rather than shrugging it off, Rick treats the intrusion as a serious violation, pulling out scanning equipment to analyze the scene for clues, eventually uncovering a hidden elevator disguised as part of the natural landscape that leads down into an elaborate, high-tech setup buried underground. The amount of engineering Rick put into protecting one single toilet on one abandoned planet says something about him before any other character even enters the story. Tracking down whoever used the bathroom without permission takes Rick through an unusually chaotic chain of events, including a visit to a restaurant run by frog-like criminals and an unplanned detour straight into the middle of a war being fought between robots and a group of lizard soldiers. Rick single-handedly shifts the outcome of that war just to retrieve a piece of information he needs, treating an entire armed conflict between two organized species as nothing more than an inconvenient obstacle standing between him and the answer he wants. That level of overkill, thrown at a mystery this small, sets up exactly how seriously Rick takes any threat to the one space in the universe he has built specifically to be left alone in. The trail eventually leads him to a quiet, soft-spoken office worker named Tony, voiced by Jeffrey Wright. Tony turns out to be a widower, someone dealing with the loss of his wife, and he explains to Rick that he is a shy person himself when it comes to using the bathroom, which led him to seek out somewhere private the same way Rick had. Rick is unimpressed by the excuse, and, unwilling to accept grief as a good enough reason for trespassing on his planet, actually opens a portal to a different reality where Tony's wife never died, bringing that alternate version of Tony forward to prove a point. That alternate Tony explains that he had simply been looking for a nice bathroom that same day too, entirely unrelated to any loss, which Rick uses as proof that grief was never really the reason behind the intrusion in the first place. Disgusted by what he sees as an excuse, Rick shoves the alternate Tony back through the portal and tells the real Tony not to use his dead wife to justify stealing his bathroom. Despite having every opportunity to end the confrontation right there, Rick does not kill Tony. He leaves behind a crude, insulting device instead, something that produces an obscene gesture out of waste material as a kind of parting insult, and walks away without following through on the threat he had been building toward the entire episode. Tony does not take the warning seriously. He returns to use the toilet again, and this second encounter turns into something closer to a real confrontation, with Tony calmly telling Rick that neither of them actually controls this space the way Rick likes to believe, even hinting at knowledge of Rick's own complicated romantic history without backing down from him at all. Rather than killing Tony on the spot, Rick instead traps him inside a chemical solution that produces a vivid hallucination, letting Tony experience an idealized version of his own life for a while, before releasing him and warning that a next offense would not end so gently. None of that intimidation changes the underlying dynamic building between the two of them. Tony is not afraid of Rick, does not scramble to defend himself, and does not treat Rick's threats with the kind of panic Rick clearly expects. That calm, unshaken response unsettles Rick more than open aggression ever could, because it removes the one tool Rick usually relies on most, the ability to make people uncomfortable enough that they back away and leave him alone. Tony does the opposite. He keeps coming back, and at one point suggests that Rick sparing his life over and over says more about Rick wanting some kind of connection than it does about mercy. The episode eventually shifts away from that standoff entirely, catching up with Rick sometime later as he goes to deliver Tony a small gift, seemingly ready to acknowledge whatever strange relationship had grown between them, despite Rick's constant insistence that the two of them were never actually friends. Instead of finding Tony there to receive it, Rick learns that Tony has died, following a battle with cancer that had clearly been affecting him the entire time the two of them were crossing paths on that planet. Tony's near-death encounter with Rick, according to people close to him, had pushed him to start living more fully in the time he had left, leading him to try things he might not otherwise have attempted, including an activity as physically demanding as skiing down an enormous alien mountain, sometimes referred to informally as a kind of extraterrestrial Everest. That final adventure, taken on shortly before his death, gets framed as something Tony chose deliberately, wanting to spend whatever time remained actually living instead of holding back out of caution. Rick's reaction to this news breaks from nearly everything else the show usually shows him doing when someone dies. He does not shrug it off. He does not immediately distract himself with another problem to solve. He shows up at Tony's funeral, and in a moment that stands out precisely because it is so unlike him, attempts to comfort Tony's grieving father, offering something close to real sympathy, rather than deflecting or making the moment about himself. For a character defined almost entirely by detachment, that small gesture carries unusual weight, suggesting that whatever had been building between Rick and Tony over these strange, hostile encounters had actually turned into something Rick valued, whether he was ever willing to call it friendship out loud or not. The final scene of the episode brings that irony home directly. Rick returns to his private toilet, the same isolated spot he built specifically to keep everyone else out, and sits down. Instead of privacy, he is met by a crowd of holographic versions of himself, a trap he had rigged earlier in the episode specifically to mock and insult Tony if he ever dared to come back a third time. With Tony gone, that trap has nobody left to target except Rick himself, and the holograms mock him instead, drawing attention directly to how alone he actually is, pointing out that nobody wants to be around him, sitting there by himself on a planet he chose specifically because no one else would ever be there. The device built to punish an intruder ends up punishing the only person left standing once the intrusion stops happening altogether. That ending lands with a particular kind of sting because of how deliberately Rick built the entire situation himself. He did not end up alone on that planet by circumstance. He chose the location specifically for its isolation, built an elaborate security system to keep any potential visitor away, and rigged a mocking, insulting trap meant to punish anyone who tried getting close enough to interrupt his solitude. The one person who eventually did get close enough to matter died before Rick ever had the chance to decide what to do with that connection. And the trap Rick built to protect his isolation ended up being the thing left running once isolation was all that remained. Writers who reviewed this episode after it aired picked up on that same irony directly, describing Rick's search for whoever used his bathroom as a strangely effective way of exposing just how much control he tries to exert over every corner of his life, right down to something as small and private as where he goes to relieve himself. One review described Tony's theory that Rick's obsession with this single toilet reflected a deeper need for control over every small detail of his own existence. A read that lines up with everything Rick does across the episode, engineering, defending, and eventually avenging one bathroom with the same intensity most people reserve for something far more important. Another review pointed out that watching Rick sit alone, drunk, on a toilet, somehow became one of the more quietly devastating images the show had produced, precisely because of how directly it connected loneliness to a character who spends every other moment of his life pretending he prefers being left alone. Tony's own attitude throughout the episode plays a large part in why the ending lands the way it does. He never once begs for his life, never panics under threat, and even asks calmly to look at a photo of his late wife in the moment he believes Rick is finally about to kill him. Facing that possibility with a steadiness Rick clearly was not expecting from someone he considered nothing more than an annoying trespasser. That composure, paired with his willingness to keep returning despite the danger, painted him as someone genuinely interested in connecting with Rick, rather than simply someone unlucky enough to stumble into his path. Rick's insistence throughout the episode that the two of them were never friends reads less like a fact and more like a defense, one that collapses the moment Tony's death actually forces Rick to sit with what losing him actually feels like. This section connects to a pattern that keeps repeating across everything already covered. A person capable of building interdimensional technology, capable of rewriting entire realities, chooses to spend that ability protecting isolation rather than building anything resembling lasting closeness with another person. The same instinct that led Rick to abandon a ruined planet rather than fix it, to numb himself with alcohol rather than sit with discomfort, to avoid a single hour of therapy through an elaborate action movie sequence, shows up again here. This time aimed specifically at keeping any other person from getting close enough to matter. Tony managed it anyway, briefly, and paid for that closeness with his life, before Rick ever figured out what to do with it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same gap between how Rick treats connection when it is standing right in front of him and how differently the people who actually share his blood have learned to survive around him becomes even clearer once attention shifts away from strangers entirely and lands directly inside his own family, where the same patterns show up again, quietly reshaping an entire generation that never had the option of simply walking away. Section 9. The daughter who grew up to match him. A grown woman stands in front of her own father, having just spent the day walking through a dimension he built for her when she was a child, and asks him a question so simple it barely sounds dramatic at all. She wants to know if she is evil. Her father, a man who has spent her whole life avoiding hard questions the way other people avoid stepping in something unpleasant, actually gives her a real answer this time, one built entirely around his own history rather than hers. That moment closes out the ABCs of Beth, the 9th episode of Season 3, which aired in September of 2017, written by Mike McMahon and directed by Juan Meza León. The episode opens with news coverage of a man named Joseph Lipnip, sentenced to execution for the murder of his own son Tommy years earlier. Beth recognizes the name immediately. Tommy was her childhood best friend, and she remembers him disappearing when they were kids, a loss she coped with at the time by imagining he had simply gotten lost inside a made-up fantasy world she called Fruppyland. She has always treated that story as something she invented as a child to soften a painful memory, laughing about how silly the idea sounds now that she is an adult. Rick tells her it was never make-believe. Fruppyland was real. A fully built, self-contained pocket dimension Rick created specifically as a place for young Beth to play safely, accessed by drawing a special door with chalk. Realizing that her childhood friend might still be trapped inside a real place rather than lost inside her own imagination, Beth insists on going back with Rick to find him. What they discover once they arrive is far worse than either of them expected. The environment inside Fruppyland has changed over the years, populated by creatures altered through mixing with human DNA, and Tommy is eventually found alive, having survived his years of isolation by doing whatever was necessary to stay alive, including behavior that leaves both Rick and Beth visibly disturbed once they piece together exactly what he has become in order to survive. Tommy accuses Beth directly of being the one who trapped him inside Fruppyland in the first place, suggesting it was done out of jealousy toward his own family situation rather than an accident. Beth denies it. The show never fully settles which version of events is true, leaving that question hanging without a clean resolution. What matters more than the specific accusation is how thoroughly it unsettles Beth's understanding of her own childhood, forcing her to consider that the story she has told herself for years, an innocent memory softened by imagination, might actually be hiding something considerably darker underneath it. When Tommy refuses to return home with them to help clear his falsely accused father's name, Beth makes a striking decision on her own, cutting off one of his fingers so Rick can use the DNA to build a replacement clone capable of standing in for him back on Earth, treating a real, living person's body as raw material for a solution, the same way Rick so often does. That single choice says something important about where Beth's instincts actually come from. She grew up admiring her father specifically for his intelligence, treating him as the parent who left rather than the one who stayed, framing her mother as the reason he was pushed away, instead of examining Rick's own repeated absences directly. That admiration shaped how Beth sees herself as an adult. Someone who values competence and cleverness over comfort. Someone quick to reach for a clever, detached solution, the same way Rick does, even when that solution involves cutting a piece off a person she once considered her closest friend. Rick, for his own part, finally acknowledges something in this episode that the show had spent years hinting at without saying outright. He admits that Beth's childhood was far more chaotic and dangerous than most people around her ever realized. And he directly connects some of the darker, more violent tendencies she developed at a young age to his own influence, his own mental state, and his own repeated disappearances from her life during years she badly needed a present parent instead of an absent, brilliant one. That kind of direct admission is rare for Rick. He does not usually name his own responsibility for anything without deflecting first. And doing so here, specifically about the daughter he raised in fragments between long stretches away, carries weight precisely because it breaks from his usual pattern of avoidance. The conversation between them, by the end of the episode, reaches somewhere neither character usually goes. Beth, having just confronted the truth about her own childhood and her own capacity for cold, calculated decisions, asks Rick directly whether that makes her a bad person. Rick answers by offering her something unusual, a genuine choice rather than a deflection. He tells her he could clone her right there, allowing an exact copy to remain behind and continue raising her own family, while the original Beth leaves to live freely, exploring the universe the same way Rick himself has spent decades doing, unattached and unaccountable to anyone waiting at home. He frames this as proof that he actually loves her, in whatever limited way he is capable of loving anyone, by giving her the option he never really gave himself the chance to consider clearly when he was raising her. A genuine choice, rather than an obligation forced onto her without asking. What Beth chooses next never gets stated outright. The show simply shows a version of Beth staying home afterward, moving quietly through the house, looking at old photographs on the refrigerator with something that looks like acceptance settling over her. Whether that version of Beth is the original who chose to remain, or a clone built to take her place while the real Beth left to explore the multiverse, is never confirmed within the episode itself. That uncertainty becomes one of the show's most discussed open questions in the seasons that follow, eventually connecting directly to a character introduced later known as Space Beth, a version of Beth living an independent, adventurous life away from Earth entirely, who is either the true original or the clone, depending on which version stayed behind that day. Later episodes only deepen that ambiguity rather than resolving it. In a later season, Space Beth is shown fighting as part of a rebellion, and during a private conversation with a doctor, she reveals directly that a version of herself exists back on Earth, a version she describes specifically as a clone, confirming that the cloning did in fact happen. What remains unresolved is which Beth actually qualifies as the clone, and which one counts as the original, since both versions of her continued living out very different lives afterward, with no clear signal from the show about which one holds the more legitimate claim to being the real Beth Smith. That unresolved status mirrors something deeper running underneath this entire episode. Beth spent her whole childhood being raised, at least partly, inside a constructed environment her father built, rather than through his direct, consistent presence. Fruipyland itself stands as a kind of physical symbol for that pattern, an elaborate, safe, entertaining substitute for a parent who found it easier to engineer a solution than to simply stay present. Rick did not fail to provide for Beth. He built her an entire world to occupy her time. What he did not reliably provide was himself. And the show finally names that gap directly through this episode, rather than leaving it as background texture the way it had for years beforehand. Beth absorbing that same instinct as an adult, favoring clever, detached solutions over slower, harder emotional work, reflects exactly the kind of inheritance that tends to pass quietly from one generation to the next, without anyone directly choosing it. She did not consciously decide to become someone who solves painful problems through cutting corners and clever workarounds rather than sitting with difficulty. She grew up watching her father do exactly that, again and again, and absorbed it the way children tend to absorb the patterns modeled in front of them, whether or not those patterns were ever named as lessons worth learning. The choice Rick eventually offers her, leave freely while a copy stays behind to handle the responsibilities, echoes the exact instinct that defined his own decision back when an entire ruined reality got abandoned rather than repaired. Rick is once again offering an exit built around replacement rather than resolution, treating Beth's difficult choice between staying and leaving as something solvable through duplication, rather than something that actually requires facing either option honestly. That he frames this offer as an act of love does not erase what it actually represents. It is, in its own way, one more instance of Rick reaching for a clever technical shortcut, rather than sitting with an uncomfortable, unresolved situation the way it actually deserves to be sat with. Fans and critics who covered this episode after it aired often described it as one of the darkest entries the show had produced up to that point, largely because of how directly it forced a normally guarded character to reckon with the parts of herself she had spent years avoiding. One review noted that the episode functioned as a kind of long overdue reckoning, forcing Beth to confront a childhood she had clearly buried rather than processed, alongside a question about her own moral character that had been building quietly underneath the surface of the show for 3 seasons before finally getting asked out loud. That same review pointed directly to the cloning twist as the moment the episode's darkness truly settled in, treating Beth's willingness to consider replacing herself entirely as proof of exactly how much damage had already been done by the time she reached adulthood. None of this resolves cleanly by the time the credits roll. Beth does not receive closure about whether she caused Tommy's original disappearance. The show does not confirm which version of her, if either, counts as more real than the other in the seasons that follow. Rick does not receive forgiveness or condemnation in any clean final form for the years he spent absent while his daughter grew up partly inside a constructed playground built as compensation. What the episode does offer, more clearly than almost anything else across the entire series, is a direct, named connection between a parent's failures and the adult his child eventually became, without needing to spell out every step of that connection through anything louder than one honest conversation between 2 people finally willing to say the quiet part out loud. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same willingness to finally name something out loud, after years of everyone around Rick quietly absorbing the cost of his behavior without ever confronting him about it directly, becomes even harder to ignore once attention turns outward, away from the family itself, and lands squarely on the audience that spent years turning every one of his worst qualities into something worth celebrating. Section 10. The Fans Who Missed the Point. Hundreds of people stood in line outside a fast food restaurant in Los Angeles, some of them camped out since the night before, waiting for a taste of a limited sauce that had not been sold anywhere since the late 1990s. When word spread through the crowd that the location would run out before most of them ever reached the counter, the mood turned fast. People started shoving, chants broke out. Police eventually had to step in to clear the area. All of this happened because a cartoon character once talked about wanting that exact sauce again someday. That moment took place on October 7, 2017, when a handful of McDonald's locations across the country brought back a small batch of Szechuan sauce, originally released decades earlier as a tie-in for a Disney movie. The sauce had gotten a mention during the premiere of the show's 3rd season that same year, when Rick delivers an extended, exaggerated speech about wanting to track the sauce down again, treating it as a kind of personal obsession. Fans latched on to that reference almost instantly, and when McDonald's decided to bring the sauce back as a promotional tie-in, the response completely overwhelmed what the company had actually prepared for. Some locations reportedly received as few as 20 packets to hand out, nowhere near enough for the crowds that showed up expecting to walk away with their own. In Los Angeles, the crowd outside one restaurant grew large and tense enough that officers had to disperse it. Similar unrest broke out at locations in other states as well. Justin Roiland, one of the show's creators, posted publicly that he was unhappy with how the whole event had been handled, specifically asking fans to treat restaurant employees with basic decency, regardless of how frustrated they felt about the shortage. McDonald's issued its own apology days later, acknowledging that demand had far outpaced what they prepared for and promising a larger supply the next time the sauce returned. None of that changed what had already happened. A joke about a condiment, delivered by a fictional, self-absorbed scientist as a punchline about his own strange obsessions, had somehow inspired real crowds of adults to shove each other over small plastic cups of dipping sauce. That same year carried another moment that stuck to the show's reputation just as firmly. When Season 3 brought on new writers, including women joining the writing staff for the first time, a portion of fans reacted with open hostility, blaming the new hires for changes in the show's direction they personally disliked. Some of that hostility escalated into people publishing the new writers' personal information online, a practice generally referred to as doxing, done specifically to intimidate them. Others, in that same wave of backlash, used derogatory language aimed at the writers simply for being women working on a show that a certain portion of its audience apparently believed belonged exclusively to a specific kind of viewer. Writers who later examined this period of the show's history pointed directly at both of these events, the backlash against the new writers and the chaos surrounding the Sauce release, as evidence that a significant portion of the fan base had developed a reputation that went far beyond ordinary enthusiasm. One piece describing this period noted that the crowd behavior seen during the Sauce incident reflected a deeper sense of entitlement running through parts of the fandom, treating access to a piece of merchandise as something owed to them, rather than something to simply enjoy or pass up. Another piece pointed out something sharper still, observing that fans obsessing over a 50-cent packet of sauce to the point of physical confrontation had almost completely missed what the season premiere featuring that sauce was actually about. An episode where Rick breaks out of an elaborate imprisonment, damages his own daughter's marriage, and causes destruction on a massive scale. All treated by the show itself as troubling rather than admirable. That gap between what the show says about Rick and how a portion of its audience chooses to receive him runs through nearly everything covered up to this point. Rick's flattest, most dismissive lines about nothing mattering get repeated online constantly, often stripped of the context Dan Harmon spent multiple interviews trying to explain, where he stated plainly that Rick is right about the universe only about half the time, despite how confidently he delivers every opinion he has. Fans who quote those lines as though they represent some kind of ultimate wisdom are, in a very real sense, doing the exact opposite of what the show itself keeps trying to demonstrate through Rick's own collapsing relationships, his repeated failures, and the quiet damage his choices leave behind in nearly every episode covered across this entire breakdown. The show's own writers have shown some awareness of exactly this dynamic. Rick is written as brilliant and quotable specifically because that combination makes him magnetic to watch. Yet nearly every major storyline eventually reveals the cost of being magnetic in that particular way. He drinks constantly rather than deal with what is actually happening inside him. He avoids therapy through an entire action movie sequence rather than answer a handful of honest questions. He abandons an entire ruined reality rather than clean up a mess he personally caused. He raises a daughter partly through an elaborate constructed playground rather than his own steady presence. And that daughter grows up mirroring his same instincts toward detachment and clever avoidance. None of that reads as aspirational once it gets laid out plainly. Yet a significant slice of the show's audience has spent years treating exactly those qualities as the reason to admire him. Part of that disconnect likely comes from how the show chooses to deliver its heaviest material in the first place. Nothing covered across this entire breakdown arrives with dramatic music or a lingering camera shot demanding the audience notice how serious it is. Dr. Wong's monologue about Rick using intelligence to justify sickness gets delivered in the middle of an episode built around a man turned into a vegetable fighting through a criminal compound. Morty's line about nobody existing on purpose gets tossed off casually before he asks his sister to come watch television. Bird Person's translation of Rick's catchphrase slides past in the middle of a chaotic house party. The show trusts its audience to catch these moments without being told they matter, and plenty of viewers do catch them. Plenty of others, understandably, walk away remembering the jokes and the loud, chaotic set pieces far more clearly than the quieter scenes buried in between them. The show's real-world production history adds another layer to this same pattern worth knowing plainly. In January of 2023, Adult Swim announced it was ending its relationship with Justin Roiland, who had voiced both Rick and Morty since the series began, following news that he faced felony domestic violence and false imprisonment charges connected to an incident from 2020 involving a woman he had been dating at the time. Roiland pleaded not guilty, and in March of 2023, prosecutors dropped the charges, citing insufficient evidence to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. Despite the charges being dropped, Adult Swim confirmed it would continue recasting his roles rather than inviting him back, and the show returned later that year with Ian Cardoni voicing Rick and Harry Belden voicing Morty, continuing under Dan Harmon's direction without Roiland's involvement going forward. A separate investigation, published later that year, raised additional allegations against Roiland, which he has denied through his representatives. That entire chapter of the show's history sits uncomfortably next to a series that spent years quietly warning its audience about the gap between how someone presents themselves publicly and what might actually be happening underneath. Though the show's fictional warnings and its real-world production history remain two separate things worth keeping clearly apart from each other. None of this erases what the show accomplished creatively across its run, and none of it means every fan who enjoys Rick's chaos has missed the point entirely. Plenty of viewers have written thoughtfully about exactly the material covered across these 10 sections, catching the quieter, heavier scenes and treating them with the weight they deserve. But the loudest, most visible reactions to the show, the sauce riots, the harassment campaigns, the endless recycled quotes stripped of the context that gave them meaning in the first place, tell a different story about how easily a warning can turn into a costume once enough people decide the character wearing it looks cool enough to imitate without asking what he actually cost the people around him to become that way. Looking back across everything this breakdown has covered, a clear shape starts to form. A catchphrase that secretly begged for help. A flask that never stopped moving, no matter how many years passed. A philosophy built specifically to make pain feel optional rather than something worth facing. A therapist naming exactly what was wrong to his face, changing nothing about what came after. An entire reality, abandoned rather than repaired. A grandson who watched all of it closely enough to eventually build his own way out, willing to use others exactly the way he had been used himself. A woman who loved Rick enough to see clearly what staying near him would cost her, and left before it could. A man who built an entire planet just to be left alone, undone the moment someone actually wanted to stay. A daughter shaped quietly by a father's absence long before she ever understood what that absence had done to her. And finally, an audience loud enough to riot over a sauce, mistaking a character built as a study in damage for something worth becoming. Rick Sanchez was never actually the smartest man in the universe by the show's own accounting, and Dan Harmon said so directly. What Rick actually became, across every season and every quiet scene tucked in between the noise, was something closer to a warning wearing a lab coat, saying exactly what was wrong with him out loud the whole time, in a voice loud enough that a person only had to be listening closely enough to hear it. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.